Thank you for hosting us here, Andreas, who did work in highlighting the importance by starting the series. Now, it's wonderful to be here alongside my esteemed from the State Department, Alec Ross, has already become a New York coming out in February. Now, I know that the senior advisor for innovation for Secretary Clinton, he was doing essentially the same work for then Senator Barack Obama. And that before his government service, he co-founded the global nonprofit One Economy, which brings broadband and other technological resources to low-income families. Now, one thing I didn't know about Alec's background, which I didn't discover until reading his book, was that he started out basically as part of a janitorial team working in a stadium in Charleston, West Virginia. Essentially cleaning. Essentially cleaning up after over-enthusiastic concert goers. So I wanted to ask, first of all, how that experience actually inspired you to write this book.
Absolutely. Well, thank you first again to l'Ambasciata Italiana negli Stati Uniti. It's always, yeah. Per il nostro paese. It's now that I'm out of government, I spend a lot more time in Italy and a lot less time in conflict zones. Yeah. So to your question I'll say what the first sentence of the book is. For those of you who haven't read The Industries of the Future, first of all, they do have a Wi-Fi connection here, so you can go on Amazon now and get it. The first sentence of the book is, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm mopping up whiskey smelling puke after a country music concert in Charleston, West Virginia. Not the typical opener to a book about the future. And the perspective really is one of, a kid who grew up in public schools in West Virginia. And when I went to a fancy college, my fancy friends went off to their fancy summer internships, unpaid internships in investment banks or congressional staffs or law firms or whatever. I had to actually go back home to West Virginia and get a job that paid money. And what that meant at the time for me was working as a midnight janitor. So growing up amidst a lot of rural poverty. And then after I left college, I was an inner city school teacher in Baltimore through Teach for America, where I had sort of a close-up view of urban poverty. So when I sort of set off on my career, I was well balanced. I had a chip on both shoulders. And fast forward 20 years, I feel really lucky. Lots of nice things on the biography. But one of the convictions that I've come to very strongly, based on the 20 years of experience that I've had, is that the kids that I grew up with in West Virginia and the students who I taught in West Baltimore are absolutely made of the same stuff as the people who sat across the conference table in the White House Situation Room from me. And so, what sort of the stone in my shoe for the longest time has been, as my own career has ascended, I've seen, the careers of the kids who I went to school with founder, and, the hopes in West Baltimore where I taught of the students who I taught dashed. And part of the roots of that, I think, is the opacity that there was about the future. People simply didn't know what to do. Parents didn't know how to better prepare and equip their kids for what at that point was going to be their digital future. Students themselves didn't have the wherewithal to necessarily know what was coming, what fields they should go into. And so the reason why I wrote the book, in part, was to take the understanding of the forces shaping our future that to this point are largely reserved to elites. And again, as my career ascended, I began, spending more and more of my time, in places like Lake Como, with elites, having very high-minded conversations. But the people who could most benefit from an understanding of such things are the kinds of folks who were growing up in public schools in West Virginia, growing up in West Baltimore. So I wrote the book to try to take the conversations that the elites have and bring it in as accessible a way as possible to a mass audience. So from mopping up puke to why I wrote the book.
So can you tell us a little bit about what you think would be the best way, both for individuals to position themselves and for countries to position themselves, given our audience here?
Well, for individuals, I'll look at it from two perspectives. First, for people who are in their careers and are trying to figure out how to make the best of the next 10 or 20 years of their careers. But then, I see these issues very much through the eyes of a parent. I have a 13-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 9-year-old. And I think parents are really struggling right now with the way that the economy is changing and trying to make sure that their kids get access to the tools that they need. So first of all, I would say for those of us who are already in our careers, the most important thing I would say is be a lifelong learner. The idea that your education ends with your last day on campus, whether you're getting a graduate degree or an undergraduate degree, people whose schooling ends there, their careers, the upward trajectory of their careers will end not long thereafter. And I genuinely believe that, a lot of the part of the reason why the political left in the United States is going so much further to the left and why the political right in the US is going so much further to the right is in part because people have an enormous amount of anxiety. And in the case of Bernie Sanders and socialists, and in the case of Ted Cruz, Donald Trump and the fascists, each of them are giving sort of very easy answers to people living with this anxiety. And so my advice in part to people who are trying to make their way through their careers is, first of all, understand where the industries of high growth are. So, the book goes through about 10 or 12 different industries where I do think the trajectory is going to be ever upward. But then the second thing is to commit yourself to lifelong learning. In terms of what states can do to prepare themselves, my key thesis is this. It's that the principal political and economic divide of the 20th century was the struggle between right and left, the political right versus the political left. I think that in the 21st century, the principal political and economic binary is the struggle between open and closed. And for the purposes of openness, in this case, I define it as upward economic and social mobility is available to people from throughout society. Religious and cultural norms are not set from a central authority, and sort of radically rights respecting, the rights of women, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities. And so no society, I believe, is completely open or completely closed. The closest to either might be North Korea as a completely closed society. And so my thesis is that those states and societies that are most open will become the home to the industries of the future. So those states and societies that really comport to the values of this sort of innovator class is where I think they're going to congregate. Throughout much of my career and sort of intensively over the last 3 years, I've been spending all my time with the people who are imagining and inventing the future, from the 22-year-olds to the 62-year-olds, the people who are starting businesses now. And regardless of what their nationality is, I do find some pretty consistent cultural characteristics about the attributes that they're looking for in a headquarters city. And I think that this attribute of openness is something that's really valued, particularly among entrepreneurs in their 20s and 30s. And I think that as we think about life beyond Silicon Valley, as we think about where innovation, wealth creation, and job creation can take place beyond a 30-mile long, 15-mile wide area, if you're thinking about, all right, well, what will the next 10 to 12 sort of global centers of innovation in the industries of the future be? I think it will largely map to those places that are very open.
I found that to be a particularly fascinating point given my own line of work at Radio Free Asia. And I thought your comparison in your book between Estonia and Belarus, two countries that started off in the same position basically at the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and which have developed into two vastly different societies. To be particularly interesting, one fact that stayed with me was that Estonia's parliament in the year 2000 actually legally enshrined internet access as a human right. But that question brings me to a question of a country like China, which is notorious for having a relatively open economy, although that can also be disputed, but a very closed political system. And it's always been interesting to me to see the contrast between a very sort of entrepreneurial population and a very sort of closed and controlling government. So I'm wondering, when you look at a society like that, with a government that's increasingly trying to control information flows, especially, how do you see innovation developing?
Well, my book is, I would say it's net positive on China, though, I am critical, I think, where appropriate about China. My name was actually a banned search term in China for 2 years.
Why was that?
Because I spent $100 million on technologies that would help circumvent, government censorship, all the VPNs you guys use when you travel there. Yeah. Taxpayer dollars paid for them. I administered the program. So China, I think, basically has not innovated much of anything in the digital space. If you look at the source code of RenRen, Mark Zuckerberg, when in Facebook, he put a little tag in there that said a Mark Zuckerberg production. If you actually look at the source code of RenRen, it says a Mark Zuckerberg production. I think that China, basically all of their innovation in the digital space has been largely derivative. I think Huawei is Huawei in significant part because what they did is they systematically stole intellectual property from Nortel, among others, over a period of a great many years, and then built the technology for cheaper. So I think that, the product of most, not all, but the product of most of China's success in the digital realm is a product of theft. And the question for China now is, all right, after the internet, in the industries of the future, will they be able to actually innovate? Will they be able to do something themselves, or do they have to continue to suck down the intellectual property of others? And my thesis is actually that I actually think that they're going to do fairly well. So genomics, for example, the world's last $1 trillion industry was created out of computer code. The world's next $1 trillion industry is going to be created out of genetic code. I believe that the world's next $1 trillion industry is the commercialization of genomics. And the Chinese, as critical as I am of them in the digital space, I think that they are extremely open and innovative in genomics. And from the people who I've spoken to, the evidence is that they've actually learned a lesson from the digital space where they don't want to be second. They don't want to have just derivative innovation. They want to create the cent-a-billion-dollar company. And so actually the world's largest center of genetic sequencing is a company called BGI. What was previously called the Beijing Genomics Institute. And unlike, again, their internet-based companies, which all of their internet-based companies, Alibaba, RenRen, Shinowiba, all of them, were largely built initially for the 1.3 billion people of China. And the goal was really to dominate and own that market and keep everybody else. Their genomics industry is actually very different. It's international from the outset. I see them partnering with the US. So BGI, for example, is partnering with Autism Speaks, an Austin, Texas-based NGO, to try and better figure out the genetics of autism. Similarly, in other fields, artificial intelligence and robotics, of the 196 countries on planet Earth, there are really 5 leading countries in robotics. The United States, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and China. And China, right at the fore of that. So as critical as I am of China in 1994 to 2014, and what I consider to be either stolen or derivative innovation in the digital space, for those areas covered in the book that are all about, all right, what's 2016 to 2026? I think that they're actually taking a much more progressive, open, honest, and ultimately wealth-creating approach to those industries.
And so you don't think that those industries and creating the space for more innovation in them is affected by the sort of closed nature of the information?
I think it is affected by it, but I think that what the Chinese government, simultaneous to cracking down on political speech, is they've created as many incentives as they can to make China an inviting place for scientists. there will ultimately be a test whether political speech maps to constrained innovation in scientific fields. We'll see. There is a historical basis for it, which I write a little bit about. I mean, if you want to know, for example, why there's absolutely no innovation that's taken place in the genomic space in Russia, for example, it goes back to the politicization of science in the USSR under Lysenko, and the effects of that. So politics can be deterministic of scientific progress. We'll see. The answer is we'll see the degree to which it does or does not constrain innovation in the industries of the future. The thing about the digital space is so much of the digital space is rooted in its information communications technology. And if information and communications is something that the state is seeking to regulate, then it stands to reason that innovation will be constrained where the state is trying to regulate it. But in these fields, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics, the commercialization of genomics, and certain others of these, they aren't really information communications technologies. They're industrial technologies, they're life sciences technologies. So it's an open question, the degree to which a closed political environment constrains innovation in those fields. And we'll see, I don't know.
One area in which countries like China and North Korea have been relatively innovative has been in cyber warfare, which you address in your book. And you actually talk about the weaponization of code as the single most significant development in warfare since the weaponization of fissile material. So I'm wondering, do you have advice both for how the US can better prepare itself for the coming, as you put it, code war?
Yep.
And also how individuals like us can do the same.
As Bei was saying, I think the weaponization of code is the most significant development in conflict since the weaponization of fissile material. The difference being the creating a nuclear arm requires access to the scarcest of scarce scientific talent and transuranium elements, whereas developing very powerful malware has a much lower barrier to entry. The book is mostly optimistic. It's, most people who write books about the future, the books are they're either utopian or dystopian. It's either, we're going to live to be 150 years old, happy, healthy, wealthy, lacking for nothing, or it's sort of fists clenched, eyes closed, bedwetting pessimism. The book's neither. I think life is neither utopian nor dystopian. It's a little bit more up the middle, and I think that's what's reflected in the book. Having said that, the cybersecurity section is a little dark. I do think, as we sit here, it's April of 2016. We live in a world of 16 billion internet-connected devices. Right now, 16 billion. 4 years from now, which is not that long from now, that number is going to go from 16 billion to 40 billion. So what's being networked? I mean, we are not putting a smartphone in every pocket. What's happening is we're networking, a multitude of other devices. And with our taking so many of our industrial processes, our supply chains, more of our information and business tools, and turning them into zeros and ones, the security threat goes up exponentially as the production of data goes up exponentially. And so I actually have a fairly dark view of sort of our cybersecurity future. To your question, I actually think that the U.S. government's doing a great job. I think we got off to a bad start, ironically enough, as a product of the financial crisis. I think that, there were, going back to 2009, 2010, then Secretary Clinton and, those who worked for her, including myself, believed that we had to take a much more aggressive posture in this domain, particularly with the Chinese. There was pushback against this from other quarters of the administration, largely focused on, and the point largely was, we're in a financial crisis. We are now issuing hundreds of billions of dollars of debt. We need people to buy these treasuries. If we throw elbows into the teeth of the Chinese on this issue, they just won't buy our treasuries. And so we saw this conflict, interestingly, between our economic well-being and the need for the Chinese to buy our debt, juxtaposed with our, the increasing conflict in the cyber domain, significantly fueled at that time by the Chinese. I think since then, the Obama administration has gotten much, much stronger and smarter. in this respect. So I think the government's doing the right things. The problem is that unlike traditional conflict, like air defenses or something like that, it's the job of government to protect everybody, right? So if somebody launches a missile against the United States, it's not a corporation's or an individual's job to protect themselves, right? That's why we have a government. But in the cyber domain, government's job isn't to protect everybody. It's not to protect the corporations. It's not to protect the individuals. And so what we see is this huge asymmetry. We see big companies with the financial resources to be able to protect themselves, but individuals, like any of us individually, or small and medium-sized businesses, have relatively little ability to protect themselves. So I do think that there's going to have to be, I do think that there's going to have to be some more public sector reach into our individual cybersecurity, lest we all grow more insecure.
There's so many different strands of this I'd love to continue, but before opening up to questions from the audience, just one final question, which is inspired by the fact that today, does anyone know what today is in the audience? Yes, Equal Pay Day, which basically highlights the fact that it takes an average American woman 15 and a half months to make the same amount of money as a man does in 12. So I know, Alec, that you didn't set out to write a feminist book, but it has been taken that way by many people. And I'm wondering if you can share with us what your discoveries were in your travels about women in the labor force.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I mean, you're right. I actually didn't set out to write a feminist book. But I ended up writing a very feminist book. And it was a product of a couple observations. I mean, first of all, for the last many years of traveling now, and apparently I've traveled the equivalent of 2 round trips to the moon with a side trip to New Zealand over the last couple of years. What I have learned is that gender bias is, as much as we talk about it, it's actually much, much worse than we even think it is. There are very few countries on planet Earth where I think are really progressive and inclusive in terms of women's role in the economy and in business. So first of all, I think it's a much bigger problem than we're even stating it. But taking the issue of fairness aside, as I researched this for years, what I saw was that the states and societies that are doing the most to advantage women's place in the economy are actually, in my opinion, those best positioned to compete and succeed in the industries of the future. And after I wrote the book, one thing that I found really gratifying is there was a study that came out from the Peterson Institute about a month ago. And it was a study of 22,000 publicly traded firms globally. And it actually found a strong correlation between the number of women, the percentage of women in executive ranks, and profitability. And so, as I traveled the world and as I looked at those states and societies and sort of compared who was well positioned and who wasn't, the more women were sort of affirmatively advantaged. And the more that people said, this is a problem, we're going to solve this problem. I thought very broadly, again, issues of fairness aside, I thought that they were most competitive. And then, bluntly in my own experience, I've run lots of teams over the years, over the last, 15 to 20 years of being an executive. And the best teams that I've run have actually been heavily female. And the last one at the State Department, the number of rock star women who work for me, Katie Stanton, Katie Dowd, Angela Baker, Alana Berkowitz, Rebecca Wayne. I mean, it's like, it was a majority female staff. And I decided to sort of seed the culture to them. And I decided I was actually going to be really passive in setting the culture of our team. And I learned, having, previously run sort of testosterone-addled teams of, young, hard-charging, startup-y guys with women in them, that actually, in my opinion, you got better products where you did allow women to drive business to a larger degree. So yeah, I'm not some crazy lefty who set out to write a book about the future that was all about empowering women. I just spent, a number of years researching this and said, the smartest thing any society can do is empower women.
Thanks very much. So on that note, are there any questions from the audience?
And I'm not a diplomat anymore, so don't feel compelled to ask diplomatic questions.
Yep.
Hi, Phil Goldstein from BizTech Magazine. We're moving towards this world in which, every device or almost every device is going to be connected. And as you said, as you increase the volume of data, the, potential vulnerabilities tend to increase alongside that. So in a world in which we have 40 billion or more connected devices, do you think that we're going to need a new, international set of norms that are codified to ensure transnational security the way that we do for or have for previous eras where you had non-proliferation treaties, et cetera, because everybody's going to be exposed to to some degree or another, everybody's going to be exposed to the same kind of vulnerability.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and the short answer is yes. For the longest time, the United States resisted norm-setting exercises in this space because of perceived asymmetry. It's like nuclear weapons in the 1940s, or 1940s, early 1950s. Because the United States was in a position of perceived asymmetry where we had so much power, and any multilateral agreement would, by its very nature, diminish or dilute our power. It was perceived to not be in our interest to engage in that kind of agreement making. Unlike nuclear weapons, though, the control of these things, first of all, is not going to just be domiciled in a small number of countries. And second of all, it's not just going to be nation states who are a part of it. And what we've seen is that the United States actually can be the biggest loser in cyber conflict because so much of our intellectual property is here. Our infrastructure is so vulnerable. So I absolutely do think it's time to do more, to really begin a serious period of treaty making in the cyber domain. As we go from a world of 16 billion connected devices to 40 billion connected devices, the way to mitigate the security threats is for there to be a set of agreements and treaties that sort of govern behavior to the maximum extent possible. Now, this won't be easy, in part because if you look at sort of what the poles of power are in this, there's the United States, there's Russia, there's China, there are a variety of other different countries. And there are two things that have really constrained the United States' ability to lead here. Number one is the Snowden revelations. So after the revelations made by Edward Snowden, the credibility of the United States in this domain generally went down significantly. So before, we were able, in the 4 years that I was at the State Department, didn't really get a whole lot of pushback when we sort of asserted our leadership on issues like internet freedom or other such things. After the Snowden revelations, our credibility went way down. And so our leadership is not necessarily going to be as embraced as widely, and it would be arrived at much more skeptically today than it would the day before the Snowden revelations. So that's thing one. Thing two is, while I think China and the United States have come closer in the last 3 years on this issue, Russia is actually very important, and Russia has grown further from us. So, it's really hard to, develop something that's global in nature without, some of the biggest nation states involved. It's a really important question.
One question from Twitter, actually, from Virtual Student is, what role virtual interns will play in the industries of the future?
Virtual interns. So first of all, it's a great opportunity for me to bring up a really great program at the State Department. A buddy of mine, so the best way, I figured out the best way to do policy making. Here's a little trick, all right? Best way to do policy making in government is get your boss to give a speech where she announces something, then everybody else has to do it afterwards. She was giving a commencement address someplace in the spring of 2009, and my buddy Jared Cohen and I were we were asked to help with the speech. When we came up with this idea, the virtual student foreign service, we should leverage the expertise of all these college students and get them to be able to work with embassies around the world. We got it in her speech. So then the State Department had to do it. And it became this wildly successful program. It's, after Jared and I sort of went on about our work, a group of very capable people in the e-diplomacy department at the State Department, led and administered by this fabulous young woman named Bridget Roddy, actually took this idea of ours that we got into a speech, and it's now a program that is scaled into, I think, more than a dozen departments and agencies in government. Hundreds, if not 1,000 more students have gone through this. And it's a great way of connecting people. So like me, I had to go and be a midnight janitor to do any sort of work because my parents couldn't afford to get me an apartment in Washington, D.C. for the summer. That's because this was sort of pre-internet, right? And so my hope is that these virtual internships can connect people in rural America, people from moderate income households who don't have rich uncles who can get them the fancy internships, with the senior officials in these departments or the investment banks. And so what I hope is that in this case, the internet can be a little bit of an equalizer.
Yeah, go ahead.
With job loss created by robotization and offshoring and the huge discontent this has created in the country manifest in this current election cycle, how is that going to portend for the future in your view? How is all this going to be integrated? How's it going to play out?
Yeah, so it's going to get worse. That's the long and short of it. But it's going to have less to do with globalization because what we're seeing is a reversion to the mean. So before, when a job went from Baltimore to Bangalore, it was because the person in Bangalore was cheaper than the person in Baltimore. But what we've seen is two things have happened. One, the cost of labor has gone up in Bangalore, but two, the capabilities of the people in Bangalore have gone up. So these are not this is not cheap, low-skilled labor anymore. This is highly skilled labor. So now people in Baltimore have to compete against people in Bangalore increasingly on the basis of skill, because where people were once, a source of cheap labor, well, over the past 20 years, they have moved up into the middle class. They have acquired skills. They have worked hard. They have gotten better educated. Their children have gotten better educated, and this is a good thing. And so, as tough as it is to have grown up in West Virginia and seen the negative effect of globalization, part of what we also saw was poverty in China go from 84% to 13%. We saw more than 1 billion people move out of poverty into the middle class. So it's been overwhelmingly good on a global basis. It's been bad for a relatively narrow segment of the world, high-cost labor markets in Western Europe and the United States, where there's a combination of high labor costs and modest skills. I think that this is actually going to get worse because of robotics. And it's going to get worse because of the combination of robotics and artificial intelligence. Because to this point, automation has largely replaced the jobs of men with strong shoulders, working in ports, factories, mines, and mills, doing work that is manual and routine. AI and developments in robotics are going to enable work to be done by machines that is not merely manual and routine, but increasingly cognitive and non-routine. So again, another reason why I wrote this book was I saw these trends, and I knew that as bad as things had been in sort of working class America, they were going to get worse if we didn't prepare people for the industries of the future. And I'll spare you sort of a long speech about what those attributes are. There's a lot about it in the book, but we do still have time. I mean, unemployment's relatively low in the United States, 4.9%, though, as we know, wage stagnation has been in place for a very long time. My worry is that wage stagnation is going to continue, but unemployment will trickle up with the next round of automation, in which case, the dismay we see in the current election cycle is only going to grow. And the only way to mitigate that, in my opinion, is to really focus on our education system and make sure that the outputs, particularly from our public schools, serving vulnerable populations like the one that I grew up in and the one that I taught in, the outputs outputs from those schools have to increasingly map to the areas of where there will be job growth. And in this case, I think we can learn a lot from the apprenticeship programs that are in place in a lot of Central and Northern Europe. I think we need to look at things like vocational education in community colleges, which is not typically what's discussed at the cool kids table, and it's not sexy stuff. But you know what? Community colleges and vocational education serve huge swaths of millions and millions of very, very vulnerable people. But vocational education today in 2016 looks like vocational education as delivered in 1956. So there are things that can be done. We don't just have to curl into the fetal position, but it does take leadership. It does take change. And if we are passive, then what we are going to see is, more hollowing out of the working class. And we're going to see potentially migration from the working class into poverty and migration from the middle class into the working class.
Michael Feldman, Create Equity. I wanted to ask about entrepreneurship, risk, and those vulnerable populations you mentioned in West Baltimore, in West Virginia, and in the Global South. What do vulnerable classes of people need so that they can take on the risk to take uncompensated time and pursue something that may produce a high reward in the future, but is a high risk in the meantime when they're coming from precarious situations?
Yeah, so I don't think as somebody who's been an entrepreneur, I don't think entrepreneurship is for everybody. And I think that while entrepreneurship is our best hope in the United States, because we are never going to be able to compete just on the basis of, cost per unit of labor, we have to be the home of where we imagine and invent the future, just as we did for the internet. We created e-commerce, we created the search engine, we created the web browser. That's how we made it over those 20 years. The only way we make it in the next 20 years is for us to continue to be the home of that. But entrepreneurship is not for everybody. And so I'm very wary of, saying that, what we have to do is prepare everybody to become an entrepreneur. Because in that case, we can actually do people a great disservice. It's a distinct kind of person that I think has the makings to be a successful entrepreneur. What I think is most important is to create the conditions where entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship can flourish. And so, as my Italian friends know here, I've been very outspoken over the last 5 or 6 years about changes that are needed to be made in Italy, for example. So 5 years ago, the mean amount of time it took to get through the bankruptcy process in Italy was 8 years. So none of my venture capitalist buddies would ever invest in Italy, because when you assume that 7 out of every 10 businesses are going to fail, you're never going to invest in Italy because you don't want to get caught up in an 8-year legal process. But part of what the Renzi government has done, I think, very, very smartly, is they have reformed a lot of their workforce laws to make Italy a more entrepreneurship-friendly country. And so I think all countries in the global South, in America, in Western Europe, what the role of government, I think, has to be is figuring out how can they create an environment that unleashes entrepreneurship. And again, this is a case where I am critical of a lot of Western Europe, where, as somebody who's been both an entrepreneur but also worked in government, I think that part of why America is flooded with so many Europeans who are starting companies in part is because it is all too often too difficult to start companies in parts of Western Europe. Though I do see this changing, and it's notable. It's changing in Italy, for example, and I do think it's notable that this is not universal to all of Europe. The number 2 place in the world right now with the most billion-dollar startups on a per capita basis is Stockholm, Sweden. Number 1 is Silicon Valley. Number 2 is Stockholm. So I do see some change here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I apologize if this question is answered in the book. I have not read the book yet. She brought me here.
You will, it's okay.
I will. So my question kind of follows up on what you were just discussing. And I guess my question is, can you name a few of the countries, 5 or 10, or a few at least,
Sure.
that have the best prospects or the most open, under your theory, and which would be a few that have the least favorable prospects? And just to make the question a little bit less easy or obvious, can you name a few surprises for each group that we might not expect?
Sure. So places that I'm very optimistic about, I'm very optimistic about the Pacific South American countries. I'm very optimistic about Chile. I'm very optimistic about Colombia. I am more optimistic about Argentina now than I was a year ago. I'm very optimistic about Scandinavia, much of Northern Europe, and into the Baltics. I'm optimistic about just about all of Sub-Saharan Africa. If you gave me $10 and said, put $10 anywhere on the map where that $10 is going to appreciate in value the most over the next 10 years, I would put it on Sub-Saharan Africa. What's happening? 20 years ago, Africa, sort of, if you played blank, what do you think of when you think of Africa? It's conflict and development assistance. Today, it's a market. And I'm wildly optimistic about the prospects in much of Sub-Saharan Africa. Optimistic about South Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. I think Japan, which has had a crappy last 30 years, economically is going to have a really good next 10 years, in large part because of what they're doing in robotics. I'm optimistic about the United States. I think it's going to be a good next 10 years economically for the United States, not for everybody, but if you're just measuring GDP. Places where I'm pessimistic about, I think the Middle East is a complete disaster. It's a closed society. It's a center of conflict. I think it's an absolute disaster, with the exception of Israel, which against all odds continues to be a center of innovation. For all of Israel's problems, it continues to produce spectacular entrepreneurs. Where else am I pessimistic about? The former Soviet republics that are aligned with Russia. Those places, they're uniformly disasters. I'm pessimistic about Russia. I think Russia has made itself, this world center of anti-growth. If you can do anything wrong, they've done it. And it's not because it lacks for genius. Russia has been chock-a-block full of technological and scientific genius, and it's just flooded the world. I mean, it's now, you can find all these brilliant Russians everywhere but Russia. I'm fairly optimistic about Eastern Europe. Where else am I pessimistic about? I guess I'm most pessimistic about the former Soviet republics aligned with Russia and about the vast majority of the Middle East.
Sure, go ahead.
Does the huge special interest influence in Washington and the huge influence of lobbyists squeeze out potentially robust new technologies that could give us more of a cutting edge with competitors around the world?
Honest to goodness, I don't know that lobbyists in Washington are going to have a lot to do with stifling innovation. Because if you think about what lobbyists in Washington can do, if you assume that they've got black hats on and they are there to, protect incumbent interests against, new market entrants, most of these products and services are going to be created independent of the public sector. You don't have to have, the President of the United States pat you on the head or sign a piece of paper saying congratulations, you can now go forth and make billions of dollars. Government is not, I think Washington is not deterministic of the degree to which we are or are not innovative as it relates to appropriations, contracts being awarded, things that lobbyists can influence. To the extent that Washington is deterministic of such things, I think it's the degree to which we are or are not investing in R&D. What are R&D tax credits and how are they structured and other such things. So I just, I am not going to place. I just wouldn't put too much emphasis on the role of lobbyists and the overall innovation ecosystem in the U.S.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Madalina Pruna. I'm from Romania. I'm happy you're so optimistic about Eastern Europe.
Great engineers in Romania, by the way.
Yeah, so some of my experience studying the IT sector in Romania showed me that software developers are young kids actually that drop out of school, just like in the US.
Yep.
And they actually do not build skills in schools, but rather staying in front of their computer at home.
Yep.
And I was wondering, given your background in education with Teach for America, what's your view of how kids can build skills in the future, given that, you know, the Silicon Valley is actually advocating for us dropping from school sometimes or things like that. So I'm just curious, like, how do you see the skills of the future and where are they built sort of maybe outside the formal educational system?
Yeah, so first of all, for all the success of Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, you know, I would never advocate dropping out of college. And I think Peter Thiel's fellowship, where he encourages people to drop out of college, is probably the stupidest fellowship ever created. Now, having said that, in places where there just isn't the educational infrastructure, perhaps in Romania, I don't know, there are increasingly world-class educational resources available for free online. It's amazing. This was not true 5 years ago. It is true now. And so my wife and I focus a lot on this. We've got, you know, again, thinking about our kids, you know, we made the choice to have our kids in public schools in Baltimore, okay? You know, we're not spending $45,000 a year on a fancy private school and, you know, just having them hang out with rich kids. You know, we're like, they're going to be in public schools. But you know, especially my wife, who's far smarter and more capable than me, and also a public school teacher herself, you know, our job then becomes saying, all right, what are they not getting in school? And this could be in Romania, it can be in Baltimore. And, you know, my 13-year-old now is studying Mandarin with a tutor online. It's incredibly high quality education. My 11-year-old daughter took an amazing robotics class. You know, there are incredible resources online. And for, you know, people who are deeply talented in Romania, for example, Johns Hopkins' Center for Talented Youth, I mean, the quality of the product that they are delivering all digitally is mind-blowing. So what's interesting, again, and this is different today than it was just 5 years ago, is if you are resourceful enough to be able to go out and find the programs, you can get educated about this. And in the last chapter of my book, The Most Important Job You'll Ever Have, I do go through and I identify specific programs, from MIT's Scratch program, which is entirely free, to Code Academy, to a variety of others. So rather than just talking about this in the abstract, in the last chapter, I actually do go through and identify specific programs. And what's interesting is, for many of these programs, the most enthusiastic use oftentimes comes from moderate to low income countries. And part of why I'm so optimistic, for example, about sub-Saharan Africa is what I've seen in terms of educational attainment in largely remote places through online education. Unbelievable. One of the companies that I advise and hold equity in now is a company called Andela. And, you know, they're based in Nigeria and in Kenya. And the thesis there is that in places with very high density, like Nairobi, like Lagos, where there has been connectivity for a while, there are geniuses. And if those geniuses get some more sort of focused development, they can become sort of Google class $200,000 a year engineers, right? And it's proving absolutely to be true. And so for people in Romania, particularly outside of you know, the capital city and in lower income places, these online educational resources can be a godsend.
Great. We have time for one last question. I'll go to him.
Thank you very much. My name is Andre Goodfriend, and I appreciate your very positive approach to the technologies of the future, the industries of the future. I've heard technologies like this also called disruptive. You know, that if you don't get on the wagon, if you don't learn these technologies, that you're going to be left so far behind that industries will be changed, and there'll be a big gap between those who are on and those who are off. Would you, where do you fall on that? Are these disruptive technologies or facilitative technologies?
So I guess first I'm showing my stripes. I don't think of disruptive as being implicitly pejorative. But so I'll just say, do I see them as being positive or negative? And again, it's going to be positive for most people. It's going to be negative for many people. I think it's sort of intellectually facile to take a utopian or dystopian view of these technologies. They're going to help us live longer, healthier lives. But as they help us live longer, healthier lives, the same technologies that will enable us to live longer lives will also facilitate our ability to create designer babies, which create a really malignant brew of new moral and ethical questions. We are going to be able to access information and do things that, based on the next wave of digitization that we otherwise couldn't do, that are fabulous. But as we do this, so too do we lose our privacy, as we increasingly live in a world of sensors. So it's, I have a very balanced view of this that's neither utopian nor dystopian, and I can't put sort of a black sticker on it or a white sticker on it. What I do believe and what I most care about are the most vulnerable segments of our population. And then not just saying, oh, it's terrible, it's bad, and again, wetting the bed, but it's like, what are we going to actually do about this? And so, my perspective, again, the West Baltimore, West Virginia perspective is, if you look at it, it's hard to be optimistic. You can't be optimistic just looking at the math of it. But then the question is, are you just going to, clench your fist? Or are you going to say, all right, let's reimagine how we deliver vocational education. Let's figure out how we can bring science, technology, and engineering and mathematics into these classrooms. Can we figure out how we change, the way that we treat and position girls in these classrooms? So it's a moderate view, neither utopian nor dystopian, but my own attitude, and maybe this is me being sort of characteristically American, as is pointed out, typically when I'm not in America, my main response to this is, all right, whether it's good or whether it's bad, what are we going to do about it?
On that positive note, please join me in thanking Alec for a fascinating discussion. And not that he needs the plug, but buy the book on Amazon, Industries of the Future. And thank you all for coming.
I heard it.